it's difficult to discuss the challenges that India is facing or will face without discussing the success story. I think economic success of Bharat is a foregone conclusion for multiple factors, and I'm not being overconfident here. I think there is a hunger for economic growth within the population, which is significantly driving the India story, coupled with the enabling factors that the government has decided to create in terms of conducive atmospherics, will certainly help the growth story. But the growth story will be impeded by law and order issues if the government doesn't come out with a mechanism to deal with the revised form of street warfare that we have been witnessing over the last 5 years, and that's not unique to India. So the strategy seems to have been employed across the world. So I don't think the way of the future is the kind of terrorist attacks that you saw maybe in the last 20 or 25 years. You're going to be looking at a lot of urban warfare, that's how experts call it, where streets are occupied and you're not dealing with an organized set of people in terms of a core group, but where they choose to unleash a larger mob, an indeterminate, unidentifiable mob. So that kind of mob warfare, I think India needs to get ready for, because if it doesn't, the experiment of at least 2 of those protests between 2019 and 2024 will be replicated at a larger scale. So I'm more concerned about how the government and the society will respond to it than about the outcome of the elections, because I'm fairly confident of what the outcome is going to be. So India has had several legacy issues, which I mentioned a short while ago in my conversation here, that there are divides of different hues and shades, and each of those divides and fault lines are sought to be exploited by vested interests within and vested interests outside. So the interesting part of the current situation is a convergence of interest between the vested interests within and outside, both of whom are interested in seeing the India story fall and fail. So there is an active collaboration, and I don't mean to sound negative here, between, let's say, mouthpieces here and certain mouthpieces which are anti-Bharat within Bharat itself. So a third consecutive defeat at the hustings or the elections would push them to a point of desperation where they are bound to go back to the judiciary on a regular basis to challenge every policy initiative, in addition to using media, academia and students as cannon fodder for protests, which I think is a scenario that currently the United States is visiting. So the funny part is there are multiple voices in the West. Those who are interested in the growth story because they want to invest in India are looking at it from a positive perspective, while those who are not comfortable with that rise are obviously looking at a different set of issues and deliberately projecting a negative picture. In my view, for a country which is the 7th largest country in the world and the largest democracy in the world, it has done a fantastic job of retaining the integrity of its institutions, something that most countries in the world cannot claim at that size and scale. Coupled with the neighborhood in which Bharat is located in terms of geography and the kind of political atmosphere prevalent around us, people, I don't think, give enough credit for the society and for the state for preserving its democratic traditions. We are not exactly surrounded by the most democracy-loving countries in the world, and yet we have managed to be a democratic nation for close to 75 years or more, at least post-independence. So there is a competing narrative here. There are competing narratives within the West about Bharat, and it depends on who you're talking to. Also, I think sometimes as a part of foreign policy, certain media outlets are strategically used to browbeat the Indian government and the Indian state into offering concessions. Inevitably, I think the West respects and worships trade. So its discussion and its lectures on free speech are inevitably connected to the investment opportunity that it wants in Bharat. So if you actually offer certain concessions on the trade table, I suspect that these voices which speak negative about India would go down. So I'm particularly mercenary and clinical about my analysis of these situations. I don't look at free speech or any of these discussions in isolation. Free speech as a conversation precedes a discussion on trade. That's how the West is operated. I'm very, very clear about it, having been a part of trade discussions. So I think it's more opportunism and less to do with principle. So as India's growth story keeps going on and it keeps moving ahead, we are bound to witness more such attacks. India must learn to develop a thick skin, forge a path of its own. I'm not saying ignore legitimate criticism, but external criticism cannot dictate who we are and what we want. So national interest must reign supreme, and in the process we will also contribute to, let's say, global challenges and addressing global challenges. But we should not do so under the threat of sanctions or under the threat of, let's say, being in the good books of the West. I don't think India cares about it anymore. It has decided to become a sovereign nation in the truest sense of the word, both culturally, politically, and geopolitically, which I think is most important. Mr. Modi is blessed with a weak opposition, and India is cursed with a weak opposition. And I don't think it bodes well in general, because the quality of the opposition also determines the quality of the democracy. And unfortunately, the kind of issues that they have chosen to discuss as part of their election manifesto and their strategy leaves a lot to be desired. It is not remotely representative of the forward-looking Bharat. In fact, according to me, it reminds you of the pre-independence colonial feudalistic days. And one wonders who are they being motivated by and guided by, and who gives them these kind of suggestions. My hunch is anti-India forces have converged in the opposition parties. And I don't say this of everyone, but I do believe that organizationally there is something terribly wrong with India's opposition at this point. I haven't seen this kind of a dry spell in terms of creative thoughts, constructive criticism, or even the ability to articulate their positions with clarity to people across the board. So I think in the interest of Bharat's own democratic traditions, notwithstanding where I stand when it comes to my decision on the politics of it, it is in Bharat's interest to have a better quality of opposition, because that is what will test the establishment of the government's policies. I certainly don't believe that every government is right in everything it does. That's exactly why you need an opposition. But when the opposition chooses to fixate on certain non-issues and to deepen fault lines, then it is not operating in the interest of the government or in the interest of the state or the society. It is operating in pure, narrow, selfish self-interest, which I think is how I would define or paint the opposition's role as on date in Bharat. Economic stability coupled with volatility on different fronts. And I think it's not just a function of Bharat's internal politics, but also because globally I sense a rise in entropy levels across the board, which could perhaps spill over into India or add to existing tensions in certain parts of India. So, which is why I said that I'm not concerned about India's economic rise. I'm more interested in its ability to handle these situations with a firm hand, without necessarily being bogged down by international opinion or West's opinion, because we need to do what we need to do to stay in the game. So, considering that we have challenges such as China to deal with, and China is a bigger threat to India considering that it's geographically right next door, unfortunately so, after the loss of the buffer state called Tibet in 1955. So I'm interested in seeing how do we gear up for those challenges, because that is the ultimate test. There was a point when Indian foreign policy was fixated with Pakistan because of Pakistan's obsession with India. Pakistan's obsession with India is never dying, but we should be more interested in what China has in store for India. And I suspect we will see some action in the border over the next few years, because obviously China is not going to be happy about losing economic opportunities. And the only way it keeps its society together is by offering a continuous growth story, which it is not anymore. And therefore an external aggression or channeling the internal angst towards an external actor has been China's traditional way of dealing with its internal problems. So therefore, while I don't want it and I don't wish it, I think at some stage over the next 3-4 years it is inevitable.